Good evening and welcome to our seminar. On behalf of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, Dr. Tiago Mallara and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you. My name is Ghulam Abbas Laka, and I have the great pleasure of letting you know that tonight will be our inaugural session for the philosophy in Interfaith Contexts Reading Group, led by Dr. Moisey, who I will introduce in just a moment. For those who are new to the forum, we are seeking to create a diverse global interfaith community of scholars, lay people, practitioners, people who are interested in religion, people who are experts, people who are lay, to have a vibrant discussion of what religion means in a 21st century context, what history means, our understanding of history across interfaith contexts. And as such, our specialist reading groups span art, Eastern Christianity, eschatology, philosophy, which will be treated tonight, Psalms, sacred texts and manuscripts, science and religion, and the list continues to grow. So without any further ado, I am very pleased to hand over to Dr. Enoch Moisey, our leader of the philosophy group. Enoch, over to you, please.
Thank you. Friends, this is the first lecture of the cluster Philosophy in Interfaith Context, hosted by the Oxford Interfaith Forum. The rationale of this reading group is to gather in a forum of discussion philosophers and public intellectuals whose reflection pertains to various religious aspects such as virtue ethics, where Dr. Skidelsky expertise lies, ontology of personhood, metaphysics of nature and God, interpretation of various social changes, interpretations of secular and religious movements, the relationship between technology and humanity, as well as comparative philosophical reflections between traditions outside the Abrahamic faith. So we will be discussing also Asian, African, and Latin American traditions. We believe that the ground of encounter between people of faith is ontology, that is to say, the way in which the faithful define being and personhood. The current philosophy in Interfaith Context Group aims to build bridges of intellectual and spiritual conversation among irreconcilable philosophical differences. Indeed, one can argue that a harmonious society is primarily based on the coexistence, not elimination, of paradoxes and contrary. So I'm happy now to hand over the microphone to Dr. Edward Skidelsky from Exeter University, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ionut, and I'll be very brief as we don't have long. So I've known James Orr a long time. We were both students at the same time at Balliol College. I was doing a PhD. He was an undergraduate studying classics. We spent a memorable week together at the Balliol College chalet in the Alps in a reading party with our college chaplain. Anyway, James has subsequently gone on to do a PhD at Cambridge in the philosophy of religion. He was for 4 years a postdoctoral fellow at the MacDonald Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Life at Oxford, and has now returned to Cambridge, where he is an assistant professor in the philosophy of religion. So I'll hand over to him, James.
Edward, thank you very much indeed. It was indeed a memorable week, and I learned a great deal on it. I'm trying to remember which year it was now, but I remember we were all rather intimidated by your intellect and insight into all the questions that we were discussing. But thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much indeed for having me. And it's wonderful to be here and a great honor to be giving the inaugural lecture in the philosophy strand of the Oxford Interfaith Forum's work. When I got the invitation, I was very flattered, but I thought to myself, am I really somebody who could contribute fruitfully to interfaith discussions? And as I gave it a little bit more thought, it struck me that a lot of the area of my work is in medieval philosophy, where I find myself reading the great Islamic philosophers and Jewish philosophers a great deal. And it strikes me there's an old scholastic distinction between de deo uno and de deo trino within the Christian tradition. And the distinction there is between what you might call general questions about God, metaphysics, as Ionut said, ontology and personhood, as against more doctrinally specific questions, sometimes called Christian evidences or doctrinal questions. And my work and this paper tonight really is, I would say, within that first bracket, de deo uno. And I think there are all sorts of interesting resonances in the argument that I'm going to be putting across within Judaism and in Islam, as well as Christianity, and even in Vedantic and Bhaktic Hinduism. And I think the relevant contrast, as it were, is is with secularism. And I think I'm going to open the paper by setting out the dominant orthodoxy of our age, which is metaphysical naturalism, not often referred to quite in those terms, but that I think is the reflexive metaphysic of the modern age. And I'm going to suggest that as against more metaphysically sophisticated, dare I say, or metaphysically invested or substantive positions, that I think all of those traditions that can gather plausibly under the interfaith umbrella do have, and certainly when it comes to articulating convincing solutions to standard puzzles and problems and conundra in ontology and personhood. So without further ado, here's a little presentation. This is a distilled version of a larger project, so please forgive me if I'm running rather quickly across what can be quite difficult terrain. And of course, I'm aware that people will have different degrees of familiarity with the different things that I'm going to be talking about: philosophical, theological, and historical. But let me just start by noting that very few propositions are more tightly interwoven into the moral imaginary of modernity than the claim that we are one another's equals. Appeals to equality in the public square are, I think, at least as convincing candidates for what Ronald Dworkin referred to, assigned to rights, namely that they are trumps. The demand for equal treatment operates as a trump across vast swathes of public policy, from distributive justice to employment law. And so I think we've got a paradox here. I think it's paradoxical that the virtually unanimous support for egalitarianism among political philosophers, and reflexively, I think, among policymakers and culturally in the public square, and indeed in our institutions, think of the equality and diversity agenda and its dominance in higher education and elsewhere across the institutional landscape of the West, that is, I think, out of sync with deep reflection on unpacking what it would mean to unpack the simple moral proposition that every human being possesses an equal moral worth. And I think that the contrast, the paradox, is that there's been relatively scant philosophical elaboration or defense among moral philosophers, or indeed moral theologians, even less among moral theologians. So what explains this asymmetry? Well, I think first diagnosis is a kind of pragmatic agnosticism, which is attributable in part to the influence of John Rawls's well-known insistence that comprehensive doctrines of metaphysics should be bracketed when formulating the principles of an ideally just society. But I would suggest that the entire edifice of a theory of justice, which hit its 50th birthday last year, rests on at least one comprehensive metaphysical doctrine, namely that basic equality is true. And he relies on this at various crucial junctures in a theory of justice. He says, quote, at one point early on, the conditions embodied in the description of the original position to do with basic equality are ones that we accept. Equality, as it applies to the respect which is owed to persons, irrespective of their social position, is fundamental. And this is a kind of an axiomatic claim. Now, the point of my paper is to suggest that that is a comprehensive doctrine, and it requires philosophical reflection considerably more than I think Rawls gives it. And so I think what we've got here is a deep metaphysical claim supporting an entire web of superstructures in public policy and across all sorts of important areas that, in fact, is basically a dogma, a secular dogma. It turns out that grounding basic equality is a remarkably difficult philosophical task. And the problem, in a nutshell, is this. If basic equality is true, if we are one another's equals, there must be some feature, some magic ingredient that all human beings equally possess that justifies moral concern to the same degree. So this is not the philosophical problem of trying to find some basis for our intuitions about human dignity. It's trying to find some basis that justifies equal concern, that justifies equal worth, in a way that fixes the parameters exclusively around human beings and only human beings. Now, the trouble is, most obviously, is that as a descriptive matter, there is no feature of all human beings that all human beings equally possess that justifies moral concern. Whatever metric one might apply, prehensile strength, cognitive ability, physical beauty, and so on. As Rawls himself concedes, quote, there is no natural feature with respect to which all human beings are equal, that is, which everyone has, or which sufficiently many have, to the same degree. We still need a natural basis for equality, end quote. So, as a descriptive matter, we've got a challenge. At this point, some philosophers would insist that the quest for grounding basic equality presupposes a sort of naively objective account of human nature, a kind of foundationalism that, in Richard Rorty's words, is in fact a world well lost. This is a hopeless quest, and rather than seeking for a solution to the problem of basic equality, we should really be seeking for its therapeutic dissolution. This is Rorty's view. And I think there's quite a lot to that, in fact. I think it's instructive that a philosopher of Rorty's stature has, as it were, given up the quest to develop on impeccably secular grounds a basis for human equality and indeed human rights altogether in his view. So I think that is giving up too early, that these skeptical strategies are naive. I think we need to look harder for a substantive justification for basic equality. What I'm going to start doing in the first half of this talk is to consider what I'm going to call naturalistic basic equality. And the idea here is to work as hard as we can to find some way of satisfying our intuitions that we are one another's equals within the confines of metaphysical naturalism. Now, what on earth is metaphysical naturalism? For the purposes of this talk, let's just say that metaphysical naturalism is the claim that all that there ever was, all that there is, and all that there ever shall be, it can be distilled and explicated in terms of scientific truths, or truths reducible to scientific truths, or truths eliminable in favor of scientific truths. It's defining metaphysical naturalism is quite a lot more complicated than that, but I think that will do for now. So the challenge here is that the only way of making sense of moral or normative claims within those metaphysical parameters is in descriptive empirical terms. And that conflicts with our intuition that variations in the empirical features of persons could never count as criteria for differentiating their moral worth. In fact, I think we could probably agree that some of the most consequential moral revolutions in history arise precisely from the recognition that whatever else human dignity and equal human worth might be, they could not consist in differences in underlying descriptive characteristics. So that means that naturalism prima facie has a problem. One strategy that a naturalist might adopt is to specify a threshold for an empirical property beyond which possession of which triggers a equal worth, but beyond which varying degrees in the possession of that property ceases to count in the estimation of moral worth. Slightly fumbled the explanation there, but that's the basic idea, right? You've got enough of some property, some empirical property, beyond which degrees in the possession of that property, the intensity of that property, cease to be morally relevant. And this is a well-known proposal developed by and endorsed by John Rawls. And the idea is to transform a scalar property into a binary property. And now I think this is an ingenious approach. I don't think it works. And I think there are three reasons for that. First, the salience of the moral salience of the threshold would be derived from some other more fundamental property. And it's not clear to me why that more fundamental property should not be preferred as the basis for moral worth, even if it is a scalar property, that is one that's capable of being possessed to different degrees. So the idea there is, if there's something special about this empirical property, then there should be something more special about having it to a greater degree. Second worry is that the threshold cannot be introduced by fiat. There must be some clear and principled rationale for stipulating the threshold beyond which varying degrees of the property cease to matter. And third, and I'm rushing over these quite quickly just for the sake of time, but we can talk about them more in the Q&A. Third, even if a plausible candidate could be identified, it would still not explain why that property would confer equal worth on a person if possessed up to a specified degree, and just cease beyond that. Now, one radical response would be to just embrace the paradox. Peter Singer, for example, invites us to infer from the fact that empirical facts couldn't ground equal moral worth between human beings as a reason for concluding that there couldn't be any moral justification for excluding non-human animals from the parameters of equal concern. So he suggests that the solution is to bring in sentience as the property limiting the scope of equal moral worth. He preserves the intuition of equal moral worth, but he simply expands the parameters to include non-human animals. And the magic ingredient, as it were, is sentience. Now, I think there are quite a lot to be said about this approach, but the most pressing objection, I think, is that sentience doesn't seem to be a feature that is equally dispersed among the beings whose moral worth it is supposed to justify. Remember, we're looking for a binary rather than a scalar property to ground equal worth. And whether or not every sentient being possesses the same determinate degree of sentience as every other is a highly contested question. In fact, there's a lot of interesting literature on this in the animal sciences. But sensory states don't strike me as the kind of thing, they vary so widely in terms of their content, intensity, duration, that it just seems an implausible candidate to me for constituting equal moral worth between all the beings that possess it, even if one accepts that it could constitute moral worth. And I think that in itself is debatable. Some naturalists might be tempted to ground basic equality in some non-empirical features. And George Scher, for example, the brilliant political philosopher, has argued that equality might consist in possessing a distinct center of subjectivity. And there are various attempts to naturalize a Kantian conception of equal human worth. Now, I think those proposals are ingenious, but again, I think as soon as the naturalist is conceding that he's got to start looking for a non-empirical criterion for equal worth, I think he's already conceding that naturalism is creaking at the joints, because the naturalist claim just is that all that there is to reality are empirical truths, or truths that are in principle empirical, given sufficient technological apparatus to track them and to itemize and describe them. A final worry, even if a naturalistic ground for basic equality could be identified, the overall account would ultimately need to be reconciled on naturalism to an exclusively evolutionary Darwinian account of the origins and development of human persons. And I think the naturalist, once he's on Darwin's bus, has a very hard time arguing why he should be allowed to get off before he reaches its destination. Now, this is a conundrum and a paradox that the naturalist has to struggle with more generally, and some of us will be familiar with attempts to put forward a dewy-eyed humanism that is in fact underwritten by a nature red in tooth and claw Darwinianism. And this is a sort of familiar problem, and I think it affects, obviously, naturalistic quests to articulate a convincing basis for equal moral worth. That would be a long and interesting discussion, I think, how we can reconcile Darwin and Pico de la Mirandola. Now, there are some interesting attempts by Neo-Aristotelian thinkers to offer, or rather, they haven't actually done this, but in the paper and in the work that I'm doing on this, I'm looking at ways in which an Aristotelian naturalism, a more expansive naturalism, could ground equal moral worth. And here I look at the metaphysical, the Aristotelian doctrine of categoricals, and roughly the idea here is that when applied to biological species, there is some set of characteristics that individual members of a species ought to possess in order to be a flourishing instance of it. So you might say, since sheep are quadrupeds, every sheep in the world ought to have 4 legs, even if it happened to be the case that, as a matter of tragic fact, someone had gone round and cut a leg off every single sheep in the world. It would still, for the Aristotelian, be unproblematically true that sheep are quadrupeds and they ought to have 4 legs. Aristotelian categoricals, and here I'm thinking of the work of Michael Thompson and Philippa Foot, in particular Philippa Foot's brilliant little book, Natural Goodness, in 2001. Aristotelian categoricals give us a way of wiring the ought into the is, of wiring the normative into the natural. It gives us a sort of toehold for the normative in our naturalistic descriptions of the world. And I think this is actually a very attractive position and promising. I'm not going to spend too much time on it now. I'm just going to say that for all of the theoretical resources that it does bring, advantages that it does bring to bear relative to the austerity model of naturalism, there are some difficulties with it. The first difficulty is that although it might ground normative judgments about species members, and it might ground certain oughts about how many teeth a human being ought to have, or how many legs a sheep ought to have, it's not clear to me that it could ground moral worth. So axiological value is a specific species of normativity, and it's not clear to me that Aristotelian categoricals deliver that. There's a big debate here, so I'm going to rush over a little bit here, but I'm just going to say that in the final analysis, this expanded version of naturalism does give us some way of understanding how equal moral worth might be grounded without getting too metaphysically speculative. But I think for the card-carrying naturalist, it's already going too far. And Aristotelianism is making something of a comeback, but I think it's generally still acknowledged by a card-carrying naturalist that it's gone too far. Yes, and Bernard Williams has some interesting things to say about this. Let me get the quote. Yes, relaxing the constraints of the reductionist rendition of naturalism does yield a clear metaphysical basis for delimiting the scope of basic equality, but at the cost of reducing basic egalitarianism to the vacuous claim that human beings are equal to human beings because human beings are human beings. And Williams says what began as a conundrum has turned into a banality. Okay, so I'm conscious of the clock here. I'm going to try and squeeze the rest of the paper into the next 15 minutes. In the second, moving from the first family, just acknowledging that there are serious problems making sense of basic equality in naturalistic terms, let's move into non-naturalistic options. And roughly, I look at two approaches that stop short of theistic accounts, stop short of religious considerations, and these would be Kantian and Cartesian approaches to basic equality. Now, I think these are, in fact, for various reasons, a little bit more promising. They're more metaphysically substantive, and that is to say, they are already trafficking in non-empirical, metaphysical, qualitative properties that are plausibly more binary and are not are less scalar, and that a human person might have, and that only a human person might have, and would not have in degrees, and would have just in virtue of the fact that they are a human being. And the most obvious thing, there's different things to say about the Kantian and the Cartesian approaches, but the notion of ensoulment, the idea that human persons have souls, here we're starting to think of, or our immaterial selves, shall we say. I mean, Kant has a lot of points out in the second half of the first critique in the Transcendental Dialectic. One of the first paralogism is this: that reason can't make up its mind as to whether or not a soul is a substance, a composite, or whether it's simple. So he doesn't think it's exactly clear cut. But something like Kant's doctrine of the transcendental unity of apperception, that is to say that there is a single metaphysical reality that must be gathering up all of the experiences that a subject undergoes in order to account for the unified character of sense experience. And that is that's transcendentally given. It's not something that we can inspect, as it were, or derive from observing the world, but it's a condition of the possibility of intelligible, unified experience as such, that there must be, as it were, a soul, a center of subjectivity underpinning, making possible sense experience. Now, that already is more attractive than George Scher's line, which says we can have naturalism and we just say, oh, there's subjectivity too. And there, Scher is actually trying to smuggle in what it seems to me something that is plainly contentious from a naturalistic point of view: subjectivity, subjectivity as irreducible. We get into difficult problems in the philosophy of mind, but I think Kant at least has got a principled framework within which that is spelled out and worked out. That is to say, here we've got a plausible ground for a property that is not scalar, and that every human person and only human persons have. So now a Cartesian coda, just very quick Cartesian coda here. There are, similarly for Descartes, Cartesian souls are metaphysically simple. They're not made of any parts. Every human person shares equally in a qualitatively identical kind of entity. That's what they are. That's what it is to be a Cartesian ego. Slightly more straightforward, and perhaps there are probably more Cartesian dualists around than there are those who are signed up to Kant's transcendental unity of apperception. So you might make a little bit more headway there. And in fact, I notice in the work I'm doing on this, I'm looking at a lot of interesting feminist arguments in the 17th century for the equality of women, elaborate in terms of the equality of Cartesian souls. Mary Astell, for example, argues that it could not be the case that equal moral worth is grounded in, say, there could not be differences in moral worth that track differences in secondary sexual characteristics, because what we are as persons is Cartesian souls, and Cartesian souls do not have, as it were, intrinsically secondary sexual characteristics. There's very interesting arguments for equality there from Cartesian souls. Now, what's the problem with this? So, and here we could just have an interesting kind of atheist, an atheist who accepts Kantianism, or an atheist that accepts the possibility that the reality of Cartesian souls independently of any kind of theistic commitment. Now, this is attractive in some ways, rather idiosyncratic and a kind of exotic approach. I think that there are difficulties with it, and I think the main difficulty is, what precisely is it that confers or constitutes moral worth on this Kantian or Cartesian picture? Surely a Cartesian soul, if there is any such thing, is pretty extraordinary kind of thing, and a rather impressive, metaphysically impressive kind of thing, particularly those of us who are not sort of used to thinking of such things. But immaterial objects are not intrinsically more valuable than material objects, even if it is more plausible to infer equal status between those objects. But it's not clear to me why simply an immaterial entity as such grounds or constitutes worth. The number 2, if it exists, is not intrinsically more valuable because it is an immaterial, spaceless, timeless, transcendent object. Good. Well, I'm just looking at the clock. I think I've got about 9 or 10 minutes, just a few minutes left, and I'm going to quickly turn now to more religiously invested conceptions of equality. And the reason I've done all of this sort of throat clearing and rubble clearing is just because really of the temperature, the climate philosophically and culturally in which we find ourselves. I think one has to motivate turns to religious accounts or theistic explanations of anything these days, simply because, you know, we are dealing with a broad degree of intellectual and cultural skepticism. And so I think we need to, rather than just go charging in, those of us who are interested in religious explanations of something like human dignity and equal human worth, we as it were have a certain kind of social responsibility, I think, as thinkers, as philosophers and theologians, to, as it were, go through what are the most, on the face of it, the most plausible routes, and that, I think, is naturalism and Kantianism and rules is starting point too. Okay, so quick quote here. This is Richard Arneson, a pretty hard-boiled secular political philosopher. It says, so far as the Western European and Anglo-American philosophical tradition is concerned, one significant source of basic equality is the Christian notion that God loves all human souls equally. But the various historical treatments of the origins and development of theological egalitarianism haven't really touched on the reasoning underpinning it. And there remain, moreover, strikingly few contemporary attempts by theologians to defend it. I think that very often this idea that that we find, say, in Larry Siedentop's Inventing the Individual and rehearsed in the more Tom Holland's Dominion, there is this sort of reflexive assumption among Christians and indeed secular people that equality is a fundamentally Christian or Judeo, in that compound adjective I don't really like very much, but Judeo-Christian conception that that equality is sort of emerges very naturally from those theological traditions. As far as I can tell, there isn't much interest in the Hebrew scriptures or in the New Testament or in early Christian writings or even in the writings of the church fathers in equality as such. That is to say, it's not really, it's rarely the focus of moral attention. I think there's a trivially true corollary of the fact that God loves every human being with, treats every human being with an infinite regard. But it's quite rarely that there isn't a sort of much egalitarian discourse or rhetoric or just explicit justifications for it. And this is I think itself worth exploring. And I think there are sort of, having said that, various ways that an egalitarian, lots of resources for egalitarianism, an egalitarian to get to work with. I think there's certainly within the Christian tradition, there's an eschatological egalitarianism. God desires that all shall be saved from the sin in which all have a share. There's a kind of hamartiological egalitarianism. All have sinned, prince and pauper stand equal before God at judgment, and kneel equally alongside each other in prayer and in worship. Paul famously in Galatians 3 elaborates a Christological basis of equality, insisting that differences in ethnicity, legal status, and sex are abolished for all those who are en Christo, in Christ. There's a kind of scriptural basis for a sort of circumstantial egalitarianism, where basic equality is grounded in the universal vicissitudes of human experience, from which even moral probity is no shield, since God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And so that there are varieties of resources and grounds for making sense of the egalitarian claim. In a recent defense of one version of theistic basic equality, Jeremy Waldron, the great legal and political philosopher, argues that there are likely to be several constituted ingredients in a religious account of basic equality. But he cautiously, having laid out a lot of them, he cautiously steps back from defending any one of them. And so I think the idea is that, you know, there's enough of a kind of cumulative case, but you know, there are lots of buckets with. Well, my worry is that on the Waldron view, there are the idea is that there are lots of buckets. They all leak, but provided you've got enough of them, you'll get the water from the river into your house. So the worry is that, you know, does the cumulative case really work in Waldron's case, given his lack of confidence in each of them? But he thinks that enough will get you there. Enough moderately strong arguments will get you there. Waldron makes a great deal of the notion of the imago Dei, the image of God. I was about to say doctrine, but I think, you know, one of the problems is, what is the status of this idea of imago Dei? It's often appealed to, and yet I think actually it's currency. It's very strong currency within moral theology. Is actually a reflection of its indeterminacy and lack of specificity as an idea. I think you often get this in the history of ideas, these sort of phrases that float around from century to century and do an awful lot of explanatory work, precisely because no one's quite sure what on earth it means. And I think with a notion of imago Dei, it's not. I think you might call it a theologumenon. I think my theologian friends might correct me on this, but it's not a doctrine, it's not a dogma, it's not even there's no creedal weight to it. The biblical basis for it is slender and murky. Again, I open things up to biblical scholars here and theologians, but I think that the scholarly consensus is that it is indeterminate. And so I think what's happened is we tend to read what we want into the doctrine, and whether it might be a human dignity consisting in rationality, then we think, well, it's our reason. It's the fact that we are rational beings and we share that with God, and that's what imago Dei consists in, and so on. So I think it's an uncertain basis, theological basis for grounding dignity and making sense of equality, but it's one that is nevertheless has a great deal of importance within the tradition. I'm going to read very quickly an extract from a sermon of the great Gregory of Nyssa. This is his fourth homily on Ecclesiastes, and I think arguably the very first, I think it's agreed, the first sustained critique of an institution that exemplifies more sharply than any other just how unintelligible basic equality once was as a moral proposition. I'm talking, of course, of ancient slavery. And this is what Nyssa says, quick quote: "What did you find in existence worth as much as this human nature? What price did you put on rationality? How many obols did you reckon the equivalent of the likeness of God? How many staters did you get for selling the being shaped by God? God said, 'Let us make man in our own image and likeness.'" So there we see explicitly just an appeal, a sort of slam dunk appeal to the doctrine of the idea of image of God. And notice how Gregory mocks the arithmetic conception of equality there. And I think this is something that is worth reflecting on in the contemporary context, when I think very often egalitarianism is spelled out in quantitative arithmetic terms. Hence the neuralgia around economic inequality, or inequality of assets or access to resources and so on. It's almost as if we are deep within the moral imaginary of the West lies the idea that equality is absolutely non-negotiable and crucial, and yet we've lost the metaphysical resources to articulate that in anything other than quantitative arithmetic terms. That's a very grand, rather speculative thesis, but I'm hoping to sustain as I go deeper into this project. Just to close, the argument that I develop is really not particularly original to me. It's one that I'm developing in collaboration with the idea advanced in a wonderful book from 2008, Nicholas Wolsterstorff's Justice, Rights and Wrongs, where he advances a theistic grounding of human rights. And I think that Wolsterstorff's idea is cleaner and simpler than, say, appeals to something like the image of God or eschatology and so on. The basic idea here is that it rests on the notion of divine love. So I think the theological or divine, infinite divine regard, the theological authority invested in the claim that God is love is unimpeachable. This is an absolutely central. There's no real debate or concern about its centrality, as there is, I think, with the Imago Dei. Bernard Williams says of the theologically modulated humanism of the Reformation, quote, "The human condition is a central concern to God, so central, in fact, that it led to the incarnation, which in the Reformation context, too, plays its traditional role as signaling man's special role in the scheme of things. If man's fate is a very special concern to God, there is nothing more absolute than that. It is a central concern, period." And what I suggest is that this fairly simple sequence of uncontroversial theological claims can ground basic equality. Yes, in Williams's notion, he makes a special reference there to the incarnation. And I think that actually the Christian theologian does have quite special resources when it comes to justifications, underwriting human dignity and human equality. But in principle, I think this is an idea that is available certainly to all the three great traditions of moral reflection within Abrahamic monotheism, that that infinite regard is bestowed upon each person, each human person, just in virtue of the fact that they are human persons, and to as it were, trivially an equal degree. So whether a theological defense of basic equality along these lines is more convincing than non-theological accounts will depend, of course, on one's prior metaphysical assumptions. And that's why I spend a great deal of time not presuming what theistic or theologically invested metaphysical presumptions. However internally coherent it may be, few who don't already share the theological backdrop that I've been sketching out and relying on will be willing to pay the additional price of the commitments it entails. Some, and I count many of my friends in the philosophy faculty here in Cambridge here, some may be tempted to invoke a reductio ad theologiam by way of response. If theism is the price to be paid for basic equality, so much the worse for finding a ground for basic equality. In its absence, many would be tempted to suggest to beat a retreat with Rorty's pragmatism. Others might be tempted to abandon what Ian Carter has called, quote, the wild goose chase for defining characteristics in egalitarianism, and follow Richard Arneson's advice that, quote, in this area of thought, the alternative positions are all bad. For Nietzsche, egalitarianism was the clearest evidence of ressentiment, the ressentiment of society's weaker members. His rhetorical posture can make it tempting to overlook the arguments that animate Nietzsche. But they're not so implausible, Nietzsche's arguments, that basic equality doesn't need to be buttressed philosophically. So I think that Rorty's pragmatist, quietist retreat may have costs. That is to say, it's not obvious to me how much longer we can go as a society running on empty. That is to say, running implicitly on the metaphysical assumptions about human dignity and human equality that have say, given birth arguably to human rights and a sort of unreflective commitment to human dignity and human equality. It isn't self-evidently misguided, at least, to worry with Nietzsche, that egalitarianism undermines the common good by valorizing the mediocre over the exceptional, by reducing the natural diversity and distinctiveness of human beings to a monotonous sameness, or by erasing individuality in favor of a kind of homogeneity that may well be a catalyst for social decline. Now, of course, I don't endorse any of those positions, but we need to be cautious of them. Nietzsche is a great rhetorician, but he's not a bad philosopher, and certainly these ideas are not unknown, especially in sort of far-right thinking in Europe. So, absent convincing arguments for belief in basic equality, there's no reason to suppose that a commitment to it will simply endure as a conventional platitude in virtue of, say, its pragmatic social benefits. And that's especially true of contemporary conceptions of human nature continue to win support that are functionally akin to a Nietzschean one. And there, of course, there's Darwinian skepticism, transhumanist, a lot of Darwinian skepticism motivating the transhumanist movement at the moment. So traction of this sort, we need to find, we need to get clear about what underpinnings there might be for what are ultimately historically contingent intuitions about basic equality. And we need to understand what the metaphysical soil was in which they grew. Just to close very quickly, what I've tried to argue in this talk, and I fear I've gone on longer than I ought to have done, is that on the assumption that theism can advance a minimally plausible account of human moral worth, it does explain more convincingly than its naturalistic rivals and its Kantian and Cartesian rivals why human worth doesn't come in degrees. And if that judgment is correct, the claim that we are one another's moral equals is not a reflexive secular piety, but a substantive religious truth about ourselves. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, James, for a very stimulating and interesting and rich presentation. I believe we have already a question from Edward Skidelsky.
Okay, so we don't have much time, so I'll try and be quick. Thank you. It's a very interesting paper on a extremely important topic. I mean, I basically agree with you, but I think it's worth stressing, maybe more than you've done, that religion doesn't give you any more than a very minimal and negative form of equality. I mean, you're right that Christianity, or perhaps other, Abrahamic religions, do bring in something that you don't find in any pagan moral philosophy, which is this idea that each human person possesses, as it were, an incommensurable or an infinite worth, something that can't be fed into any kind of calculus of consequences. And this is, where we get the basic deontic intuition from, the intuition that there are some things you just can't do to people, regardless of the consequences. And, and this is, I think, the ultimate foundation of our notion of human rights. So that's all, I accept that. But, I don't think you can derive from this any general presumption in favor of equal treatment. Certainly you can't derive from it any, notion of political, or still less of social or economic equality. I mean, it's purely negative, right? There are some things you just can't do to people. and in that sense, we are all equal. But as you said, that's kind of almost a trivial consequence of the more important claim that, humans have, have this sacred worth. And in fact, just as a matter of historical fact, Christians, until I think the 19th century, didn't try to derive any more ambitious program of social or political equality from their own doctrines. They were on the whole pretty hostile to anything of that sort. So
Thank you, Edward. I think I'm in agreement with you. I think nothing in my argument was saying that metaphysical equality entails political egalitarianism or an egalitarian doctrine of distributive justice, say, instead of, say, a doctrine of distributive justice grounded in sufficiency or priority, as Parfit might. My objection ran in the other direction. My objection was where one is obsessively egalitarian in approaches to distributive justice and so on and so forth, and in the public square, that does seem to presuppose a very deep claim about the equality of all human beings. So yes, I think that you could have a metaphysically substantive account of of equal human worth, and then it would be up to, there'd be sort of independent debates as to how that should be cashed out. But I certainly think that that if you are a committed political or economic egalitarian, that does presuppose equal moral worth. As I said, I think actually what's going on is a sort of substitution effect. I think that we are still deeply enculturate, we're deeply committed to the notion that that human equality is important. We've lost the metaphysical basis to articulate it, and so we shift to other ways to articulate it. And those are economic, they might be Marxist, they might be equal opportunity and so on. They might be quantitative because we're happy with, we can measure things, and we can measure things in naturalism. We can't measure soul, we can't, souls are spooky, we don't want to have that. We can't make any note sense of qualitative equality.
Next question from Sandy Kress.